They went on foot through the Allegheny Mountains, cutting through Pennsylvania, and ended up just a muddy outpost, 30 odd buildings stuck there. And that's what William Henry Harrison, the son of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, decided to call home, this frontier outpost. Well, there was a reason for that. In this period of time, this was where a lot of East Coast people were moving. This was the big land rush to get out there to, Johnny Appleseed emerges out of Indiana. He's buried in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The notion, advertisers say, he planted apple orchards everywhere and they're blooming throughout Indiana and Ohio. And so you had all these people with land speculation deals coming into the Northwest Territory. The big job was, how do you make it safe for the new settlers? And that's really what Harrison devoted the heroic proportion of his life to. He became at first at age 18, his men he was not like Andrew Jackson, who was a natural leader of men. Harrison came about it in a very difficult way because of his gentlemanly fashion. He was very tall, well-mannered, reserved. He had 3 general rules, Harrison, that he tried to live up by, that he wanted to sort of self-discipline himself. One was temperance. He wasn't going to drink. The second was that he was never going to be found into a duel, that real men did not duel. And that, thirdly, that he was going to study everything about military science he could. And he did all that. And he worked with General Anthony Wayne, and had a tremendous victory in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers on the Maumee River. The Maumee River is in the city of today's Maumee, is right near Toledo, Ohio. And it's a wonderful battlefield site there at Fallen Timbers, where you had the victory over the Indians at Fallen Timbers. And in these Indian battles, victory over the Indians in the region, the Shawnee, Tecumseh, whatnot, was really victory over Britain, because Britain was still trying to have control over that region of the Northwest Territory. So he became known as, if you like, an Indian fighter and somebody who was fiercely anti-British in that region. There's also a fort in Perrysburg, Ohio, Fort Meigs, where they've reconstructed a fort you can go to. I know this because I went to Perrysburg High School. I grew up in Perrysburg, Ohio, and we used to go out to the fort all the time, and they've done a wonderful job of making it an interpretive center on one side of the Maumee, and Fallen Timbers is on the other. So they're 2 of the important sort of pre-War of 1812 battle sites in that region. But he really became a national hero. He was in the mold of a slightly lesser version of Andrew Jackson after the Battle of New Orleans at the Battle of Tippecanoe. That took place on November 7th, 1811. And what happened at Tippecanoe was, you have the extraordinarily important figure, Tecumseh, who was the great leader of the Shawnee. More than the Shawnee, he was an intertribal leader of the Shawnee and native people. And if you had to do a dual biography of William Henry Harrison with another person, it would be Tecumseh versus Harrison in showdowns. But at any rate, at the Battle of Tippecanoe, he was able to defeat the Indians and therefore make that area safe. The Battle of Tippecanoe is by present-day Lafayette, Indiana. And Harrison became an overnight hero because all these people are coming out to that region. And meanwhile, that was November 7th, 1811. By June of 1912, you have the War of 1812. And I might add that Harrison was appointed, they used to be called, when Jefferson made the deal for it, and it became the Northwest Territory, in 1800 they divided them up. There was the Ohio Territory and the Indiana Territory. And Harrison was appointed governor of Indiana Territory. So, roughly 1800 to 1812, he was the governor of that region of the Indiana Territory, hence his job of, making it safe for settlers to come in. Well, War of 1812 meant he was at war with Britain. And you get more battlefield heroics after the hero of Tippecanoe. Mainly, he retook Detroit, present-day Detroit, from the British and controlled it. And then in one of the truly significant battles at the Thames River in Ontario, he was able to defeat the British and the Native Americans, the Indians that were working with them, and Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of Thames, the great, Indian leader of this period. So Harrison was that kind of forever ended the British trying to control the Great Lakes region, the Old Northwest Territory. So he's sort of be considered by some people in that period, at least, the savior of that area for the new settlement. Oddly enough, after all those heroics after the War of 1812, he went back to North Bend, Ohio, where really right outside of Cincinnati on the Ohio River, and had no real money. Even though he came from this aristocratic background, was a great hero, he was constantly in debt. His house was a kind of open place for people to visit, and he would entertain a lot, but there was never really any kind of income. In fact, when he was elected president of the United States, he had a job as a county clerk. I mean, he was working as a clerk. So he's a person misunderstood in a lot of ways, and the only reason he was sort of touted in the 1830s, 1836 was for when the Whigs wanted him to be a presidential candidate, was because of his battle heroics. He was the new Andrew Jackson. Everybody was trying to create a new Andy Jackson, and you could do that with Harrison because of his military background. But one of the worst depressions our country's experienced was the Great Panic of 1837, and there was a great amount of economic dislocation and currency problems and hardship. And Harrison, by 1840, was being marketed in this sort of. There's some people that will look at the election of 1840 as the beginning of the modern political marketing of a campaign. Tippecanoe and Tyler too became the saying. Tyler being John Tyler of Virginia, a Southerner, and Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison representing Ohio. It was going to be this alliance between, in many ways, the South and the new states from the old Northwest Territory. Well, it was an extraordinary campaign, very low on substance. William Henry Harrison did not go and kind of lay out issues for people. It became a carnival-like atmosphere. Where you started having the Whigs doing what they call their log cabin campaign. In fact, the term booze for drinking alcohol came from a log cabin booze party. A man named Booze in Philadelphia that was for William Henry Harrison would put his whiskey in log cabin like containers, jars that people, and then he'd also have these booze parties. So the term booze for alcohol grew out of that 1840 campaign. As of course did the OK, saying OK for Old Kinderhook, the home of Martin Van Buren. But at any rate, and Keep the Ball Rolling emerged out of that 1840 campaign because the Harrison people had a big ball of twine, like hemp twine, and that they would roll into, grow to show the growing momentum of the Harrison campaign. So hence the saying, keep the ball rolling. So from a sense of political campaign history, William Henry Harrison's run for the presidency in 1840 is one of the most interesting and colorful to look at. But as I said earlier, once he won, you can't really claim that he was a president. You can't rate him or put him in the pantheon of American presidents because he had no time to serve.
C-SPAN's 20th anniversary series, American Presidents' Life Portraits, continues with our 9th president, William Henry Harrison. We currently have about an hour and a half left of programming. Now a conversation with Gerald Gawalt, a curator with the Library of Congress, on President Harrison's papers. This segment lasts about 16 minutes.
Today we have items from the William Henry Harrison papers. The first item is a letter that Nicholas Biddle of Philadelphia wrote to Daniel Webster, who would ultimately be Secretary of State under William Henry Harrison. And in the letter, wrote him. And Webster had said, if General Harrison lives, he will be president, if an all-wise providence shall spare his life, which was rather prophetic as we shall see. But in response, Biddle had written, coming administration will in fact be your administration, which I can honorably support and be connected with. And this letter reflects the general feeling that Harrison would be president, but that other people, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, would actually be the administrators of the presidency. During the campaign, William Henry Harrison was called Mr. Mum because he didn't say a thing. He adopted the front porch strategy of sitting on his porch and saying nothing during the campaign, which, considering the tenor of the campaign, was rather difficult, but we'll talk about that on some other objects.
Well, other things that you have are about the campaign, and even though you suggest he kept silent, was on the front porch, one of the classic political campaign slogans in history is related to his campaign.
Yes, the Harrison campaign of 1840 is said to have been the first modern campaign. And what we're going to see is a series of objects here that reflect the new style of campaigning, and that is very loud, very verbal, very outgoing, a lot of organized parades. In fact, at one point, Tyler's supporters rolled a ball all the way from Tennessee to Washington, saying that the Whigs kept the ball rolling while their opponents sat home. But Harrison said virtually nothing during the campaign on any issue. And these two documents here are campaign biographies. The one on the right is a campaign biography written about what purports to be all of these similarities between Washington and Harrison, beginning with the fact that they were both born in Virginia and working their way all the way up to the fact that both were men of virtue and they both defeated the British in major battles. So there's a full page of similarities between Washington and Harrison. And when we get to the inaugural address of Harrison, we'll see that Harrison himself also adopted somewhat a similar view of himself and former President Washington. The other item here is a colorful brochure called the Tippecanoe textbook, which, as you referred to earlier, reflects partly the campaign slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe was a battle that Harrison won against the Indians, led by Tecumseh. It was one of the major victories against Indians in the Ohio Valley, and Harrison literally rode the glory of that victory to the White House. And so in the Tippecanoe textbook, you can read all about Harrison's victory, all about his triumph over the British at the Battle of the Thames during the War of 1812, and his subsequent writings about his career. So these two documents are, in essence, not the first campaign biographies. Actually, the first campaign biography was written for Thomas Jefferson's campaign by John James Beckley. But they certainly reflect a new interest in multiple documentation and large, extravagant claims during the campaign. And the next object we're going to look at reflects more of the popular view of a campaign.
In other segments that we've done, you've talked about presidents either truly claiming being born in a log cabin and others perhaps falsely making that claim.
Yes, well, William Henry Harrison was one of the people who claimed to be born in a log cabin. The log cabin and hard cider became his two campaign symbols, you might say. And his supporters went around the country hauling replicas of what was supposed to be his homestead and handing out hard cider to people. And this reflects that view. But in essence, William Henry Harrison was born in a mansion on the lower James River in Berkeley, Virginia. His family had been planters for generations. His father had been a member of the Continental Congress and, in fact, was quite well-to-do, although they did come across some relatively hard times for them in the 1790s, which is why he moved to the Ohio frontier. But certainly he was not born in a log cabin. Actually, Andrew Jackson and later in the series, Abraham Lincoln were the two presidents who were actually born in log cabins. One of the other interesting things about his birthplace is that Harrison and Tyler were actually born in the same county in Virginia, Charles City County, Virginia, which in some ways technically might be a violation of the Constitution, since the Constitution requires electors to vote for a president and vice president from different states. So though when they were actually campaigning, Harrison was living in Ohio and Tyler in Virginia. They were both not only from the same state, but were literally neighbors in the same county. So it's another one of those interesting ironies of history that people go away and then come back in a demonstration of the small world concept.
Harrison was eventually elected, and another item that you have for us is his inaugural, which over the years has received a lot of publicity because of its length and the weather of the day, but part of the papers here is the inaugural in his handwriting?
No, the handwriting is actually his nephew and his secretary, Henry Harrison. There are some emendations in his handwriting. Harrison, as you said, was elected president. In fact, he came to Washington right after the election and just kind of walked around town and seemed to enjoy it. In fact, outgoing President Van Buren made what today would be called a sexist comment and said that that Harrison was so tickled to be president, he was like a woman with a new bonnet. He couldn't get enough of it. So Harrison certainly enjoyed being president, although his enjoyment was rather short-lived. His problem started when he wrote what was, for almost 2 centuries, the longest inaugural address, and then on March 4th delivered it in a cold rain. Harrison was the oldest president up before Ronald Reagan, and between wearing himself out, enjoying being president, standing in the pouring rain and freezing, he came down with pleurisy, and ultimately made his self-denial in the speech. He said in the course of it that he would never run for a second term, made that a rather prophetic statement by the fact that he didn't survive the first month. So his inaugural address has several distinctions, most of which are not good.
In another segment, we'll find out a little more some of the specifics of that. But in this book here, you also have, even in those days, there were inaugural balls, and you needed a ticket.
Yes, and one of the things that wore out Harrison was enjoying his presidency. Even though his wife never left Ohio, she has the distinction of being the only presidential wife never to get to occupy the White House. Harrison enjoyed the evening festivities, and in here we have a ticket to one of the Tippecanoe inaugural balls. This one was at Carusi's Saloon here in Washington. There were many celebrations then, as there are now. Harrison spent most of the evening and the early morning going from one to another, getting wet and cold, and adding to his illness. But it's an interesting reflection of the activity that went on.
You said was that a saloon? Did the connotation of a saloon in those days, is it similar to what we might have today?
Well, it was a drinking establishment, but they would have had a dance floor. It would have been more like a restaurant rather than simply a bar. But it was a reflection of the tenor of campaigns as the number of people were able to vote, that the campaigns, starting with Jackson, became more and more popular, and so the people they attracted to the inaugural celebrations were of a wider spectrum. Almost 400,000 people attended Harrison's inauguration, so they had to find something for them to do, and obviously eating and partying it had to have someplace for the hard cider.
But he did take ill, and another of the documents you have for us, again in this same bound volume, is a letter from Benjamin Harrison to William Henry, March 28th of 1841.
This is a letter written by another nephew, Benjamin Harrison, who was in Berkeley, the family home in Virginia. And it's a long letter written as William Henry Harrison lay dying in Washington, asking his uncle for a job. And one of the things that they say wore out William Henry Harrison was the endless number of patronage seekers that kept him up all day and night, and he couldn't even go for a walk without people going up and asking him for jobs. And William Henry Harrison liked to shop for his own food, so every morning he would go out and go to the market and purchase his own food for the day at the White House, but he was so inundated by job seekers that it would take him hours to get through going to the market. And this letter just reflects the continual request for patronage. And in this letter, Benjamin points out all of the things that he did for his uncle, and why he should. He says he's not asking for a job, but in essence, he says if you have one, I'd be happy to take it. That seemed to be part of the routine, that people would say, I don't want a job, but if you ask me to, I'd be willing to make the sacrifice.
And then the president did pass away, and there was a funeral service for him. And a program from that funeral service is also part of the Library of Congress papers of William Henry Harrison.
When Harrison was also the first president to die in office, and so there was quite an outpouring of emotion and sympathy for William Henry Harrison and his family. This is a broadside advertising a eulogy that was held actually in Lowell, Massachusetts. There were eulogies and services on the same day, April 7th, throughout the country. This was a service in which the main speaker was Caleb Cushing, who was later had the distinction of being turned down not once but twice to be Secretary of the Treasury under President Tyler, but also the distinction to be the first American minister to China and to negotiate the first treaty with the Chinese. And so it's a standard funeral broadside of the day, certainly a little more elaborate ceremony than most people would have, but it reflects the mood of the day, and certainly the mood when Harrison died.
Here's a look at what's ahead. Next, historians talk about the life and times of President Harrison. Then we'll take a look at his Senate career. After that, a discussion on his inaugural address. And later, presidential historian Michael Beschloss on the importance of preserving presidential sites. This Saturday evening at 8 Eastern and Pacific, American Perspectives. First on the program, political satirist P.J. O'Rourke. Then at 8:55, Latina Magazine editor-in-chief Patricia Duarte, discussing leadership for Latinos in the 21st century. And at 10, Michael Bloomberg, president of Bloomberg Financial Markets, talks about business and technology issues and his role in the industry. American Perspectives begins at 8 Eastern here on C-SPAN. And on Sunday evening at 7 Eastern and Pacific, Road to the White House will show you Senator John McCain's comments to political leaders and New Hampshire business executives. Road to the White House, C-SPAN's weekly look at the 2000 presidential campaign. Now, our American President series continues. Next, a segment from Washington Journal. In 1995, we traveled to Ohio to speak with historians about the life and times of William Henry Harrison. This segment, which begins with a brief video biography of Harrison, lasts about 20 minutes.
William Henry Harrison was the 9th President of the United States, serving the shortest term in office, from March to April of 1841. He caught pneumonia and died 1 month after his inauguration. Harrison was the only Whig president from Ohio. The remaining 7 were Republicans. Born on February 9, 1773, in Charles City County, Virginia, he was the last president born a British subject. Through his paternal grandmother, he was related to King Henry III of England. His father, Benjamin Harrison V, opposed British colonial policy and was one of 7 Virginians to sign the Declaration of Independence. William Henry Harrison grew up during the American Revolution. He decided to become a doctor at a young age, enrolling at Hampton-Sydney College, then at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. Shortly after his father's death, his funds ran dry, and he gave up medicine to join the Army. Harrison married Anna Sims in 1795. She was the only woman to be wife of one president and grandmother of another. Because of her husband's sudden death, she never lived in the White House. She was given the first pension for a president's widow, totaling $25,000. The couple had 6 sons and 4 daughters. Their 3rd son, Congressman John Scott, was father to President Benjamin Harrison. William Henry Harrison was a professional soldier from 1791 to 1798, and from 1812 to 1814, retiring as Major General. He fought in both the Indian Wars of the Northwest Territory and the War of 1812. In 1800, Harrison was appointed governor of the Indiana Territory, serving for the next 12 years. Victory against the Indian Confederacy at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 earned him the nickname Old Tippecanoe. Harrison then went on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1816 to 1819, as Ohio State Senator from 1819 to 1821, and as U.S. Senator from 1825 to 1828. During his political life, he pushed for universal military training and benefits for veterans. In 1836, he was defeated by Martin Van Buren in his first presidential bid. 4 years later, in 1840, Harrison was elected president. He was 68 at the time of his inauguration. John Tyler of Virginia was his vice president. Harrison served in office for only a month. After an inaugural address lasting 1 hour, 40 minutes on a cold March day, he caught pneumonia and died on April 4th, 1841.
We continue our week looking at Ohio presidents with President William Henry Harrison. He made his political career from and is buried in North Bend, Ohio. You see on that map down in the lower left-hand corner next to Cincinnati. And next door to North Bend is Cleves, Ohio, where we'll be going in just a few moments to the Cleves Presbyterian Church. And we'll be talking here in several segments today about the Presidents Harrison, the 9th President, William Henry Harrison, and the 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison. Both had connections to this part of Ohio. The only grandfather and grandson to be presidents of the United States. And inside the Cleves Presbyterian Church, we'll be joined today by all of our guests and find out what connection this church has. Our first guest is Marjorie Buress, who's the author of It Happened Round North Bend. Good morning, Miss Buress.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for being with us. Tell us first a little bit about where you are and what connection the Cleves Presbyterian Church has to the Harrisons.
Well, we're meeting in the Cleves Church. The land on which the church stands was given by General Harrison and his wife Anna in 1831. This is the second church on the site. It was completed in 1851. And the Harrison family attended here, and their children and grandchildren were christened here.
Now, in reading about William Henry Harrison, he was the last president to be born a British subject. He was born in Virginia. How did he make his way and eventually end up in North Bend?
Well, he came to Cincinnati to Fort Washington in the military in 1791, and he ended up marrying the daughter of John Cleves Sims, who was the founder of the Miami Purchase. And Judge Sims founded North Bend, and so he and Anna settled there on land given by his father-in-law.
Now, I understand near the front of the church are several items connected to the Harrisons, a Bible, a christening picture, and a deed. And if we could start with the deed, can you tell us about that?
Well, the deed, of course, is for the land on which the church stands, and it was given by General Harrison and Anna in 1831. General Harrison laid out the town of Cleves in 1818, named it for his father-in-law's family.
And the Bible there, what connection is that?
Well, it was given by Anna to the church when this particular building was completed in 1851, and she presented the Bible to the congregation.
You've written, and we have here in our studios, I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the monitor there, your book, It Happened Around North Bend, A History of the Miami Township and Its Borders. Can you give us an idea of what this part of Ohio around North Bend was like in 1840?
Well, this was still a very, very rural area, and was really identified mostly with Cincinnati. And along the river, that's where all the settlements were at that time.
And you've brought with you the Log Cabin newspaper. Is that the correct term for it?
Right. It was published by Horace Greeley, and it was started in 1840, and it was primarily published to promote the campaign of William Henry Harrison. And of course the campaign was known as the Log Cabin Campaign, and it was the first campaign with singing and coonskin caps and log cabins and cider, and it was very well known at that time.
Well, we're going to talk in a few minutes about that campaign. Before we let you go, what do you think we should know today about William Henry Harrison and his times and his life?
Well, I think that he was a man concerned with the people. He gave his entire life for his country, and from the time he left Virginia and came to Ohio, 50 years, he was in the eye of the public. He was on the ground floor of the settling of the Northwest Territory, and he certainly figured in the settlement of the West.
Marjorie Buress is the author of It Happened Round North Bend. Thanks for taking a few minutes for us.
It was my pleasure.
And we have another guest with us out there we'll be talking to in just a few moments. We might tell you that William Henry Harrison had some connections with some of the presidents before him. President John Adams appointed Harrison to be Secretary of the Northwest Territories, and then he was appointed governor of the Indiana Territory and was reappointed to that job by Presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And joining us in just a few moments from the Cleves Presbyterian Church will be Judge Albert Mestemaker, who is going to tell us shortly about a little bit more about William Henry Harrison. One of the things that was a first in the campaign of 1840 of William Henry Harrison was the Democratic press. He was a war hero, and he was called General Mum because he didn't say much, which was the tradition of those times for the presidential candidates to not campaign on their own and have surrogates campaign for them. And so he broke with tradition, and in June of 1840 made what many historians think was the first presidential campaign speech. And also in that election of 1840, one of the Whig presidential electors from Illinois was Abraham Lincoln. Judge Albert Mestemaker is joining us now from the Cleves Presbyterian Church. Judge, good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning.
What do you think U.S. history missed or lost because William Henry Harrison died so quickly in office?
We might have had an earlier resolution to the problem of slavery had President Harrison lived to fill out his term.
Why do you say that?
Well, he was anti-slavery. In fact, due mainly to his efforts, the states of Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin were brought into the Union as free states. He was always opposed to the idea that one human being could own another human being. The problem with his early death after 30 days in office was the ascension of a Virginia slave owner and plantation owner to the presidency to replace him. And I think it put off the whole question of dealing with the issue of slavery for another 20 years, which unfortunately, as we all know, led to the Civil War.
What was he like? What was his personality?
Well, he was a military man, and from what we've read about him and studied about him, he was a no-nonsense guy, probably somewhat on the, I would say, similar to a George Smith Patton Jr. You read his negotiations with Tecumseh and Blue Jacket and the other Indian tribes. There was very little compromise and very little give and take. Harrison himself was not anti-Indian, but it was his job as a soldier to carry out the settlement of the Ohio Valley and the lands in Indiana, and he was quite a forceful negotiator with the Indians and really didn't give much in the way of compromise. So I would have to say he was a man who was stern, dedicated to his principles, and rather unyielding.
We have some footage of William Henry Harrison's tomb. Could you tell us where the tomb is in relationship to where you are and what people see when they go there?
The tomb is approximately a quarter of a mile from where we're standing today. The tomb is in the village of North Bend, just off of Highway US 50, overlooking the Ohio River. It's a place that was a favorite place for Harrison to ride his horse up onto in the evening and take a look to view the river. And he actually, through his wife, chose that site for his burial, mainly because of the fact that her husband enjoyed riding up on that hill in the evening when they were here in North Bend and taking a look at the river.
How did you become interested in his life?
When I moved to North Bend, I quickly discovered the sad state of condition that both the tomb and the cemetery were in, and a group of residents, including Mrs. Burris and Beverly Myers and her husband Terry, we formed a nonprofit organization which is known as the Harrison Sims Memorial Foundation, mainly for the purpose of raising money from the state to repair and improve both the tomb and the cemetery. The tomb has been neglected for a long time.
He was a Whig candidate and then president. Where would he be on the political spectrum today?
Conservative, if that's the purpose of your question.
Yeah, which party he might be in?
He would be a Republican today.
And in reading about him, the election of 1840, many accounts say it was the first of what we know as modern campaigning. What can you tell us about that?
You know, he really didn't travel much. He depended mainly on his reputation as a soldier. The Battle of Tippecanoe, of course, was his first major battle that he was famous for. And we also earlier had the Battle of Fallen Timbers in Ohio. The slogan is probably unique. I think it's probably the first campaign for presidency in the United States where you actually had a slogan, which of course that year was Old Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But his military record and the fact that he was so well known in the important states, the states that had control of the Electoral College, is what catapulted him into the presidency. Because the general or the popular vote was much closer than the Electoral College vote.
We actually have some of that music the songs of 1840 that we're going to play for our viewers. It lasts about 30 seconds. And the lyric in this is, what has caused this great commotion our country through? It's the ball that's rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and with them will be little Van. Van is a used-up man, and as we hear that, we're going to see a page from this book called Running for President by Simon & Schuster, which some of the campaign portraits that were used in the election of 1840. But here's just a little bit, some of that first campaign music.
What has caused this great commotion, motion our country through? It is the ball that's rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And with them we're beating the Van is a used-up man, and with them we're beating the Van.
And that's a little bit of campaign music from 1840. I understand that there's a pickle barrel story that's particularly appropriate.
To the Harrison family?
Yes.
John Scott Harrison, who was the son of William Henry, and by the way, he's unique in the history of this country because up until this time, John Scott Harrison is the only man who was the son of one president and the father of another. He was the father of Benjamin Harrison. He was a congressman from Cincinnati, and when he died on his farm in 1878, his funeral was conducted the next day at the Congress Green Cemetery, which is located right across the road from the tomb. While the family was burying John Scott Harrison, it was noticed that a 10-day-old burial site of a nephew, which was very close to his burial site in the cemetery, had been disturbed. Further investigation revealed that the body had been stolen from that tomb. The Harrison family, in looking for the body of the nephew who had been stolen from his grave, went to the Cincinnati Medical College the next day with a search warrant. They didn't find the nephew's body, but they found the body of John Scott Harrison in a pickle brine barrel. And apparently, the very evening of his own burial, John Scott Harrison's body had been stolen by the Resurrectionists, which was a group operating in this area, and sold to the Cincinnati Medical College for use by the medical students for dissection purposes. The body was recovered, of course, fortunately, and temporarily placed in the grave site of a friend of the family in Spring Grove Cemetery. It wasn't until 1894 that John Scott Harrison's body was returned to North Bend, and unfortunately, and for reasons that we're not aware of, today he's buried in the family vault close to his parents, but in an unmarked crypt. So we're not exactly sure which one of the crypts inside the family vault bear the body of the man who's the only man in this country who's the son of one president and the father of another.
We have just a few seconds left. If we want to learn more about William Henry Harrison, what would you suggest we read?
There are several very good books. One is Counterpoint, which is a book that discusses the parallels of the lives of William Henry Harrison and the great Indian chief Tecumseh would be a good book to start with. And that's, of course, a book that would appeal to people of all ages. And I'm going to defer, if you don't mind, to Marjorie Burris for the names of other books, because Marjorie's our local expert on what to read to learn about the Harrison family.
Well, Judge Albert Mestemaker, thank you very much. We'll be back here a little bit later to learn more about Benjamin Harrison, but we want to thank you for your time this morning to talk about the 9th President, William Henry Harrison. Thanks for being with us.
Quite welcome.
You're watching C-SPAN's 20th anniversary series, American Presidents' Life Portraits. This week, we're taking a look at the life and times of the nation's 9th president, William Henry Harrison. We currently have about an hour left of programming. Now we discuss his Senate career with Senate historian Don Ritchie. This segment lasts about 10 minutes.
Don Ritchie is an associate historian of the U.S. Senate. Among the presidents who previously had served in the Senate was William Henry Harrison. Tell us about his time here.
That's right. Harrison, people think of as a military leader from the Tippecanoe battle. They think of him as a president for just a month. But he had served in Congress before. He had actually served originally as a delegate from the Northwest Territory back in the 1790s, briefly. Then he'd served in the House of Representatives from Ohio briefly, and then he'd served as a senator from Ohio briefly. He knew the Congress, and he'd certainly had experience here. He wasn't a stellar member of Congress. That wasn't why he ran for president in 1840. He ran because of his military experiences and territorial governor and things like that. But he certainly knew what Congress was, and he'd made contacts here. And he'd served here in the 1820s at a period when the U.S. Senate was becoming a very influential part of the federal government. When he first came to Congress, he served in the House. And really in the 1790s and up through the War of 1812, the House of Representatives was the main part of the legislative body. People thought that that was where the political action was going to be. That's where James Madison was the leader of his party in the first Congress. They thought of it as the House of Commons in the British Parliament, whereas the Senate was going to be the House of Lords. It was a place where more senior people would go, and they really wouldn't involve themselves as much in the politics. They would sit back and deliberate and read over the legislation the House sent them and perhaps perfect it with amendments. They really didn't anticipate that the Senate was going to be the powerful position, the place that it became. In fact, the press didn't pay a lot of attention to the Senate in those days. When a member of the House was elected to the Senate in 1804, he wrote home to his wife and he said, henceforth you won't read much of me in the Gazettes, because they pay little attention to senators. So originally, Harrison was in the body that was the active body. In 1820, that began to change because of the decision to bring in one free state for every slave state and vice versa to settle the burning territorial issue. The U.S. Senate was, from that point on, evenly divided between the southern states that had slavery and the northern and western states that didn't have slavery. And that meant that the single most emotional issue of the day that was going to be decided in the U.S. Senate. It was going to be compromised here. Whatever legislative solution would be dealt with in the U.S. Senate. And so one by one you see the powerful leaders of the House like Clay Webster and Calhoun and others coming over to the U.S. Senate. And so when it's not unusual in that circumstance when Harrison comes back, he comes back to serve in the U.S. Senate. But in all of those cases they were very brief periods of service. Of course, his presidency was also a very brief period of service.
His time in the Senate, he chaired the Military and Militia Committee. What did his military experience bring to that?
Well, today we have an Armed Services Committee, but that's because our armed services have been unified after World War II. And when the armed services were unified, then the committees were unified. But actually, in the early years, and when the first committee system was set up here in 1816, after the War of 1812, when they felt they wanted some expertise, and they created a series of committees, but they would have a separate military affairs committee for the Army, a naval affairs committee for the Navy, and a militia for those who were not part of the regular troops. And so since Harrison was General Harrison of military fame by this point, he chaired the Military Affairs Committee and also the Militia Committee. And in those days also, you didn't have to start here as a junior senator and spend your entire career trying to get seniority so you could get to chair an important committee. In those days, they would actually vote on who would serve on those committees. And they would then usually tap the person who seemed either got the most votes or seemed to have the most prestige to serve. So Andrew Jackson chaired the Military Affairs Committee, and so did William Henry Harrison. Part of that period also was sort of a defensive period after the War of 1812, trying to build back the military and the coastal defenses and others. But it was a peaceful period, and so it's a relatively safe time to be chairman of a military committee in that sense. Although there were still difficulties in Florida. In fact, one of the problems was with Andrew Jackson, who was down in Florida at that time, and certainly there were certainly military issues that had to be dealt with by Congress.
You mentioned his short presidency, which began with the longest inaugural speech.
That's right. In those days, inaugurations took place in March. The government began on March the 4th, which seems an appropriate date, but it was set up initially by the Constitution as deciding how many months after the Constitution was ratified. And while you would think of March would probably be a better month than January in Washington, March is a rather cruel month in Washington. It can be very wintry. And Harrison was in his late 60s, and he delivered a very long speech. Actually, the original draft of it was even longer. Fortunately, Daniel Webster did considerable editing on it. I think Harrison was insecure and tried to make himself sound a little more erudite and forceful, and he went into a very elaborate discussion of Roman generals and a lot of things that were mostly oratory. He stood outside for an hour and a half without an overcoat, and it obviously didn't do his health any good. And he lasted a month in the presidency, but he was never in great shape, and he died of pneumonia just a month later. But actually, in that 1 month's time, he managed to alienate the leader of his party in the Senate, who was Henry Clay. Henry Clay thought that he should have been elected president in 1840. He was, in fact, distraught that his party didn't turn to him. He always said, they nominate me when there's never a chance of my winning, and they never nominate me when anybody knows that my party would win that election. And so Clay also didn't think very highly of Harrison as a legislator or as an executive. He thought that Harrison would serve, in a sense, as a king, and that he would be the prime minister. He would run the government from the Senate chamber. And Clay actually had a very ambitious legislative program, the American system, that he had been devising over time as a longtime member of Congress, as a Speaker of the House, and as a U.S. Senator. And he intended to enact this program, and he expected Harrison to go with him. The first thing Harrison did was to appoint one of Clay's political opponents to a really political plum job as collector of the Port of New York, where all the patronage, all the money was coming through there. And that was all through the 19th century. There's a lot of political fights over who gets to be collector of the Port of New York. And Clay was very annoyed that of all people, somebody who had opposed his nomination in 1840 would be rewarded with this. And he objected, and basically Harrison told him to stay away, not even come and bother him at the White House. Well, this was not about to make Henry Clay a loyal supporter of the president. And so the probability is if Harrison had lived, he would have had an extremely difficult time with the Congress and with the Senate in specific.
C-SPAN's 20th anniversary series continues with a discussion on President Harrison's inaugural address with the Library of Congress's Gerald Gewalt. The segment lasts about 10 minutes.
Gerard Gewalt of the Library of Congress, part of the William Henry Harrison papers you have, is his inaugural speech, the longest in history up to modern times. Tell us the significance of that speech and what happened not only when he made it, but afterwards.
Well, the greatest distinction for the speech is that it's long. It was written by William Henry Harrison at his family home in Virginia, and actually shortened quite a bit by Daniel Webster and others, who wisely told him it was too long. But unlike George Washington, who when he was told his inaugural address was too long, scrapped it and wrote an 8-page summary of what he was going to say, William Henry Harrison kept his, and it's actually a lesson in constitutional history more than it is the standard inaugural address about what he was going to do. So it's very interesting in the sense of a set piece of where a president of the United States thought the Constitution was at a particular point. The handwriting is actually that of his nephew and secretary, Henry Harrison. There are some emendations in his hand, but it does seemingly go on forever, and the fact that it was delivered in a cold rain in Washington made it, I think, go on forever. Apparently, while he was delivering it, he may have been the only person listening, because the newspapers of the day reported that the people in attendance got up and started walking around and went undercover and came back and started soliciting for patronage jobs, hoping that when they returned to their seat that Mr. Harrison would be finished. And it did take well over an hour and a half to deliver this speech, which is about 30 some odd pages of closely written manuscript.
And out of those pages you have chosen for us several segments that are key. Perhaps you could read several of those for us.
Yes, I have a couple things to read. One is, as I mentioned earlier, the comparison to General Washington. He himself started out his inaugural address in an imitation of Washington's inaugural address. And Harrison writes, "Called from a retirement which I had supposed was to continue for the residue of my life, to fill the chief executive office of this great and free nation, I appear before you, fellow citizens, to take the oaths which the Constitution prescribes as a necessary qualification for the performance of the duties." He then says, I'm going to proceed to present to you a summary of the principles which will govern me in the discharge of the duties which I shall be called upon to perform. And then in the style of the speaker who starts back at day one of the world, Harrison then went back and started with the Roman Republic. And so in the second paragraph he gets to, "It was the remark of a Roman consul in an early period of that celebrated republic that a most striking contrast was observable in the conduct of candidates for office of power and trust before and after and obtaining them." Well, unfortunately for the audience, Harrison then went through and drew almost unlimited comparisons between the Roman Republic and the American Republic in a constitutional lesson that, had it been in a classroom, surely would have put his students to sleep long before the hour and a half was up. But there are a few parts of it that are interesting and some that are still have a resonance today. And I would like to jump to one or two of those. About on page 7 of this speech, he gets to the part that everybody loves power, and that as president, he says, he goes on for a while talking about Roman emperors and Athenian princes, etc., etc. But then he gets to, "I give my aid to it by renewing the pledge heretofore given that under no circumstance will I consent to serve a second term." Unfortunately for Harrison, he also didn't have to worry about serving his first term, but he was prepared to step down after the first one because he thought that there was too much power in the presidency, even in the 1840s. Then he goes on to list a large number of things that he says contribute to the president having power. And I'd like to, he goes through the power of the veto, the power of patronage, which of course was very much on his mind. Then he got to the controlling the press, which has an interesting resonance even today, given the White House's current attempts since then to try to control the flow of information to the press. He says, "There is no part of the means placed in the hands of the executive which might be used with greater effect for unhallowed purposes than the control of the public press. The maxim which our ancestors derived from the mother country, that freedom of the press is the great bulwark of civil and religious liberty, is one of the most precious legacies which they have left us. We have learned, too, from our own as well as the experience of other countries, that golden shackles by whomsoever or by whatever pretense imposed are as fatal to the iron bonds of despotism." Then he goes on to discuss a number of the golden shackles, which I think we can be spared. But then he goes on to discuss on page 17, if anyone was listening by that point, that another issue that still looms rather large, at least for those people who live in the District of Columbia still, and that is that the District of Columbia did not have any self-government. And in this particular context, he was concerned that because the people of the District of Columbia didn't have self-government, they couldn't outlaw slavery, whereas in other states, the state had control of slavery. In the District of Columbia, because it was a federal district, they did not have control of it. So, but the issue is that he says, it is in this district only where American citizens are to be found who under a settled policy are deprived of many important political privileges without any inspiring hope as to their future. Then he says, we are told by the greatest of British orators and statesmen that at the commencement of the War of Revolution, the most stupid men in England spoke of their American subjects. Are there indeed citizens of any of our states who are dreamed of their subjects in the District of Columbia? Such dreams can never be realized by any agency of mine. The people of District of Columbia are not the subjects of the people of the states, but free American citizens. Then he goes on to talk about how he would take their views into account in calling for legislation. But as we've talked about, the speech droned on and on. He went through Athens, through Octavius, and finally, after about 35 pages of text, he got to the final end and said, fellow citizens, being fully invested with that high office to which the partiality of my countrymen has called me, I now take an affectionate leave of you. Little did he know how prophetic he was. You will bear with you to your homes the remembrance of the pledge I have this day given to discharge all the high duties of my exalted station according to the best of my ability. And I shall, upon their performance, with entire confidence in the support of a just and generous people. I'm sure that by the time he got to the end, most people didn't know that he had stopped, as they probably were not paying any attention. But Harrison believed that he had given a very important constitutional lecture about the state of the nation and the state of the Constitution. And it was a very important issue then. They had just come through the whole nullification crisis. They were gearing up for another battle over the extension of slavery, whether Texas would be annexed. So the whole issue of constitutional rights and duties was very much in the forefront of people's minds.
Here's a look at what's ahead. Next, historian Michael Beschloss on the importance of preserving presidential sites. After that, a look at international issues. First, the Moscow Evening Newscast on day 2 of impeachment hearings against President Boris Yeltsin. Then the Serbian newscast on NATO airstrikes. And later, a discussion on public perceptions in the judicial system. This Saturday evening at 8 Eastern and Pacific, American Perspectives. First on the program, political satirist P.J. O'Rourke. Then at 8:55, Latina Magazine editor-in-chief Patricia Duarte, discussing leadership for Latinos in the 21st century. And at 10, Michael Bloomberg, president of Bloomberg Financial Markets, talks about business and technology issues and his role in the industry. American Perspectives begins at 8 Eastern here on C-SPAN. And on Sunday evening at 7 Eastern and Pacific, Road to the White House will show you Senator John McCain's comments to political leaders and New Hampshire business executives. Road to the White House, C-SPAN's weekly look at the 2000 presidential campaign. C-SPAN's 20th anniversary series, American Presidents' Life Portraits, continues with a lecture by Lyndon Johnson biographer Michael Beschloss. He spoke recently at the Lyndon B. Johnson Library and Museum in Austin, Texas, as part of a conference on historical sites related to American presidents. His remarks last about an hour.
It would be hard to imagine a more appropriate keynote speaker in this particular venue and on this particular topic than is Michael Beschloss. Michael's been called by Newsweek the nation's leading presidential historian. And Michael has spent countless hours in this marvelous facility on his research for Taking Charge, which is a remarkable book based on the Johnson tapes and covering 1963 and 1964. And I asked Michael how many hours, in fact, he had spent on the trail of LBJ, and he said, put it this way, I've had about 3,000 conversations with LBJ. Michael is a son of the heartland, having been born in Chicago, but he came east for his education at Williams and at Harvard. He's held some very important positions in the public sector, for example, at the Smithsonian, as well as in the Academy at Oxford University and at Harvard. But he's carved out a special niche for himself as America's leading historian of the presidency. In that regard, he's written a series of best-selling and award-winning books touching in some way or another with every president, starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and going all the way through the chief executive associated with the end of the Cold War. And that's an extraordinary achievement. His most recent book, Taking Charge, is the first of what will be a trilogy on the Johnson years as revealed and his careful mining of the tapes and the manuscripts connected with the tapes. Michael is also very well known as a lecturer, and my guess is there's not a single person in the auditorium who's not seen Michael on television, especially on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer or on other public broadcast programs. But as a matter of fact, he's been on all the major networks as well. As a historian, his work is hallmarked by his exhaustive research, his eloquent prose, his powerful insights, and most importantly, by intelligence and balance. The reader or the listener of Michael Beschloss is never distracted by the sound of a grinding axe. Furthermore, he's a quintessential gentleman. Our keynote speaker, Michael Beschloss.
Dan, that was so kind of you. I appreciate it enormously. And I should add that I had the tremendous privilege that any historian or lover of history should have last June, which was to have the privilege of walking through Monticello in the company of Dan and also of David McCullough. And I remember so much while going through there, one of the things that David said, which was, I think, very relevant to everything that all of you do, which is, as you're walking through this house, think of this house as Thomas Jefferson's biography and look all about you, because even if you knew very little about Jefferson at the time you walked in the front door, by the time you left, it would be as if you had read a long life history of Thomas Jefferson. And one of the reasons why Monticello does that so well is because of what Dan has been doing for the last 15 years, which is a monument not only to Jefferson, but also to the way I think a presidential site should be run. You know, Dan was mentioning the fact that I have spent many hours in this building in seance with Lyndon Johnson, to the point that anyone who doubted his decision to make these tapes of 10,000 of his private conversations from the beginning of his presidency to the end should only think about the fact that if there was any better way to bring Lyndon Johnson back to life years after he left us, I don't know what that would be. And it sort of reminds me of the fact that yesterday when I was coming down here, I was about to go to the airport and I was saying goodbye to my 4-year-old son. And he said, "Where are you going, Daddy?" And I said, oh, I'm going down to Texas. And he said, oh, are you going down to see President Johnson? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes, I am. Because not only because of the tapes, but also because of this building and also because of the historic sites that Leslie Hart oversees so well, we have a wonderful way to commune with LBJ many years after he did leave us in 1973. And you know, speaking here from this lectern, I remember so much with a great deal of poignancy the fact that the last time President Johnson appeared in public, he was standing right here, which was at a civil rights symposium that Harry Middleton and the Johnson Library put on in December of 1972, just a month before he passed away. And as I was listening to his voice on tape at the beginning of this morning, it really made me think very much that if you had to think of an appropriate place for LBJ to make his farewell to all of us, couldn't have been a better thing than for him to be here in this library speaking about civil rights to many of the leaders who had helped to integrate American society. I was talking early this morning with Harry about the fact that you all have to worry about bringing large numbers of people into your presidential sites. It's a large part of what you do. And this was not something that was remote from the mind of President Johnson. Harry was mentioning earlier that if he looked out in this auditorium and he saw 2 red seats empty, he would say, whose idea was it to paint those seats red? He couldn't stand the idea of 2 empty seats. And the same was true with the Lyndon B. Johnson Library. And Harry tells a story about the fact that very close to the moment that this library was founded, there was a big football game across the street, University of Texas, at the stadium. And LBJ called up Harry and said, I think it'd be a great idea if you were to have an announcement made at the end of the football game that anyone who's watching the game who wants some cool water and wants to use the bathroom can come across the street and come to the Johnson Library. And I think his idea was that thousands would flow into the building and swell the numbers for that afternoon. Harry tells me that it was close enough to the beginning of this library that actually they didn't have any cool water yet, and I don't know if the bathrooms were fully functioning. But it shows you that even a great ex-president has to worry about numbers and making sure that a presidential site is fully used. As Dan was saying, I listened very closely to the tapes that President Johnson made, and I was fascinated to hear about 10 days into President Johnson's presidency, already he was beginning to think about how he would be looked on in history, not by historians, but in terms of visitors to the places that he had lived during his lifetime. Because even while he was vice president, he was beginning to think about the restoration of his childhood home. And about 10 days into the presidency, despite everything else that LBJ had to worry about, taking the reins after John Kennedy's death and unifying the nation and getting everything back on track, there's this wonderful conversation where he is talking to one of his sisters about the fact that they're restoring the house and they're thinking about what furniture to put in and what pieces of furniture that various family members might give up. And there's this one wonderful line that I think will ring true with all of you, and that is Johnson says, I think it's going to cost about $1 million to restore that tiny little house, which he was a little bit surprised by. But that is something that even a president has to worry about. And there's one other tape that sort of brought home to me the fact that even while a president is very busily in office, he has to think about what he's going to do with his ex-presidency, libraries and historic sites and so forth. President Johnson is talking to his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy. And Bundy makes a reference, I think, to a piece of paper and says, you know, you want to hold on to this sort of thing because this is the kind of thing that you'll want to have in your presidential library. This is about May of 1964. And Johnson says, well, I'm president now and I'm busy. I don't care about any presidential library. And Bundy replies with the magic words, someday you will. And that proved to be, needless to say, very prophetic. You're all meeting here these several days on a very important subject, not only for all of you who are up on the barricades of presidential sites, but all of us also who are writing presidential historians, and that is the relevance of presidential sites as we go into the 21st century. And I guess perhaps in my own case, the place to begin is to relate my own first experience with a presidential site, which was when I was 7 years old in Illinois. It was April of 1963, and it was the 98th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's death. And it was also at the time of the Civil War centennial, which perhaps some of you will remember was a very big deal in those days. It followed the sesquicentennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth in 1959. And between 1961 and 1965, there were all sorts of Lincoln events and Civil War events all over the country, which even came down to a small child. I remember I had something called the Civil War Centennial Harmonica, which I often played. And at the time I got it, I don't think I knew what the Civil War was or what a centennial was, but I sure did like that harmonica, and it began to get me interested in the Civil War. So in any case, spring vacation that year, my parents took myself and my brother down to Springfield to see the Abraham Lincoln sites. And I can remember as a small child going to New Salem and seeing what Abraham Lincoln had done, famously splitting rails, and the post office he had been in, and the various things that people had been doing in that frontier town. And I also encountered a name I'd never heard before, which was the name of William Randolph Hearst. There was a large plaque, and it turned out that William Randolph Hearst, as some of you will know, donated the land for New Salem in 1906 and made it possible for that restoration to occur. And then we went on to the Lincoln homestead at 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield. At that time, the Lincoln home had been reasonably well restored. It was owned by the state of Illinois at that point. And for a small child to walk through that house, and I remember seeing Lincoln's umbrella and an umbrella stand, and actually hearing about the privy in the back, which to a small child sort of was a very human detail, and seeing the bed that Lincoln had slept in, and particularly the beds that his small boys had slept in. That was something that really brought Lincoln home to me. And growing up in Illinois, Lincoln, needless to say, was even more of a god than I think he was and is in the 49 other states. That was the period of time that we in Illinois began putting on our license plates, Land of Lincoln, and Lincoln was a very present figure in our lives. But until I went to New Salem and went to the Lincoln home, I didn't really have as much of a sense of him as a human being as I did later on. And the final stop on the tour was, we went, of course, to the Lincoln tomb just outside of Springfield. And in those days, I guess it's not true anymore, but there was the bust of Lincoln in front of the tomb. In those days, it was on a pedestal that was low enough that you could reach up and rub the nose for good luck, which we all did. I think so many people rubbed the nose that I gather it's now on a larger pedestal, and unless you're Paul Bunyan, you'll have a hard time rubbing the nose. But the point is that once again, this, for a small child, made Lincoln live for me. And I can remember going into the tomb, and this will sort of give you an idea, I guess, of what it's like to be living in Illinois and under the Lincoln aegis. There were plaques on the wall showing that the Lincoln sons were there and Mrs. Lincoln, but there was another plaque saying that Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, was not there. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And I didn't know what this Arlington National Cemetery was, but I remember feeling personally stung that he had not decided to be buried in Illinois. And I wondered if Robert Lincoln had felt that Illinois was not good enough for him to be buried there. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of the way you relate to all these things. And I guess the reason I tell this long story is because it turned out to have a very relevant connection to my own life, which is that after that trip, I was an absolute Lincoln fanatic and have read everything on him ever since then. and have been always fascinated particularly by the assassination of Lincoln and how that might have changed history, and the fact that this was one of these pivotal moments where you imagine had Abraham Lincoln lived beyond 1865, the whole history of the United States might have been different. And I am just, as it turns out, now beginning to write a book of history of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln that'll take about 5 years, using, at least at the beginning, a lot of the artifacts and documents and books that I've saved all the way back since I was 7 years old. So I wouldn't want to suggest that everyone who walks through one of your presidential sites will one day write a history or a biography of the president that you're dealing with, but I think it is one example of the way that having that experience, especially at a very young age, can hit a young child extremely hard. One thing that occurs to me as a writing historian is that, as I was suggesting earlier, we who are writing about presidents, I think, are facing some of the same problems that you are in one particular way in 1999. And that is that if we were writing about presidents in, let's say, 1965, at the time that President Johnson had just been elected in his own right and was waging the war for the Great Society, I don't think it would take very much even to explain to a small children that it is a very important thing to know about presidents of the United States. You just had to turn on a television in those days or read the newspaper to know that in those days presidents were the center of the American political solar system, and if you wanted to learn about American history, it was not a bad idea to learn about the history of presidents, so that in the 20th century it was not at all stretched to talk about the 30s and the 40s as the Roosevelt years, or the 1960s as the Johnson years. But the point I would make now is that in the aftermath, especially of the Cold War, and given the changes of in our political system in the 1990s, I think there is a very good chance that presidents will not be quite as central as they used to be. If you go back to the Constitution, the founders were terribly worried about having presidents who were too powerful. They were worried about another King of England. And the result is that if you look particularly at the presidents of the 19th century, and many of you encounter this in the sites that you deal with, they were lesser figures than the Abraham Lincolns and Franklin Roosevelts and Lyndon Johnsons. They tended to be Benjamin Harrisons and Rutherford Hayes, people with very important records, but they were not the kind of national celebrities the presidents became in the 20th century. And I think that one thing that occurs to me is that we who have dealt with the history of presidents had it pretty easy from the early 1930s until the late 1980s, because that was a time that you had the imperial presidency. Presidents had this enormous and growing power in domestic affairs. People were very happy to have a lot of power going to Washington. During World War II and the Cold War, presidents had almost omnipotent authority around the world. And that was also the time when presidents had enormous mystique, from the time of the summits that Franklin Roosevelt participated in the 1940s all the way through late George Bush in the early 1990s. So my point is that during that time, presidents were so central that you could almost imagine that people would flow into presidential sites and read the histories of presidents almost like iron filings would be attracted to a magnet. And what I'd like to suggest is that those days, at least for some time, are probably over. Presidents are going to be terribly important figures in our political